What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the Everyday Athlete Podcast. This episode is going to be a little bit different from the ones in the past, where I'm actually going to be doing a solo episode today, really diving into my story and my background and how I've gotten to where I am today. And I want to keep this theme going, along with the guests that I'm going to have on this podcast, telling their unique stories, moments that we share together, but also just the lessons that they've learned, throughout their own journeys. And I feel like, touching on where I've been in my past and what has led me up until this point will really provide you guys with a lot of details that I haven't even talked about yet. And my intent with this is to take this further, beyond this episode and really document the process, pull back the curtains and really show you guys the journey and the building of the Everyday Athlete brand. And so, to start this thing off, I really just wanted to rewind back to, where I grew up, which was in St. Louis, Missouri. So I'm not even an Ohio guy, but, these days I almost like claim as if, I'm from Ohio. I've been here so long. I love Columbus, but I'm actually originally from St. Louis, Missouri. I was an athlete my whole entire life as, a youth athlete playing, soccer, baseball, pretty much everything. And then as I slowly got closer to high school, that's where my focus started to get more isolated on lacrosse and football specifically. I actually started playing lacrosse around 7th grade and then started playing football in 8th grade. And that's really when I fell in love with those two sports. And that's when I decided, as I started to transition into high school, to really focus on those two. And so I ended up going to Christian Brothers College High School, CBC, in St. Louis. We've had, several athletes, especially on the Ohio State football team, come out of my high school. And this is really where I started to take sports very seriously. And I really started to deepen my skill with these two different areas of athletics in lacrosse and in football. And as I got closer to, my junior year, my senior year, I was playing on varsity. I was getting a lot of accolades. I started to get recruited for both sports. And around this time, it was really difficult. And I was on the fence trying to decide, would I play lacrosse in college? Do I play football in college? Do I try to play both? It was kind of that decision, that crossroads of, what journey do I take from here? And around that time, I really wanted to go to a big school. I always wanted to go to a big university. And with football, I was really only getting recruited by like WWII schools, like smaller D1 schools, D2 schools. And I just really wanted that big school atmosphere. And a pretty crazy side story is a coach actually came to St. Louis from the East Coast and started this club lacrosse team called Missouri 22. And this is really where my lacrosse recruitment took off. This is where he brought in college coaches from all over the country, and using his connections and the high school coaches that he knew in the area and from all over. And he brought all these coaches in to evaluate everybody in the state of Missouri to try out, college coaches included. So it was kind of like a 2-for-1 recruiting style day, but also a day where they could evaluate the guys that would make this 22 team roster. And the catch was everybody in St. Louis could try out. Everybody in Missouri, not even St. Louis, but everybody in Missouri could try out, and only 22 guys would make it. But then everything would be paid for, the trips, everything like that. And so I ended up doing this tryout and ended up killing it. And that's really where my lacrosse recruitment took off. That's when I started to get recruited by universities like Rutgers, Michigan, Ohio State. I had a visit to Columbus, Ohio, and that is really when I fell in love with Ohio State. And I knew that was really where I wanted to go. I always wanted that big school feel. I wanted a city that was really engulfed in the athletics and in the university. And Ohio State checked every box. And that's really when the decision became so clear. And I decided to take my talents to play lacrosse on a full ride scholarship at Ohio State. And this was hard at first because being in that, decision of, do I play lacrosse? Do I play football? I kind of had to go with my gut with what I felt at the time. And, when I got to Ohio State and I was on the lacrosse team, it was new, it was fresh. I pretty much ran with it right away, but I just had this feeling. I had this gut feeling that, I maybe made the wrong decision, that, I was getting pulled and really felt this just gravitational pull back toward football. And I was back in that decision of, was this the right call? Did I make a mistake? Really kind of questioning the decision I had made. And this is when I really just kept leaning into that gut feeling of what felt right. What was the sport that my heart was really in? And I came to the realization about midway through my freshman year at Ohio State on the lacrosse team that football was it. I had made the wrong decision. It wasn't settling with me. I just didn't feel right. And I knew I had to play football. And I didn't know if it was going to be at a place like Ohio State or if I was going to transfer. So I was, talking to my high school coach, trying to think through the different universities that had recruited me to potentially transfer into somewhere. A lot of guys I played lacrosse with were transferring out and transferring different places. And so, I really just made the decision. I'm like, I love Columbus. I know I love this university. And I actually, funny story, the only person I knew on the Ohio State football team at this time was Ezekiel Elliott. He was from St. Louis, Missouri. We had actually met at a party in St. Louis, kind of exchanged numbers and contacts and stayed in touch knowing we both were going to Ohio State. And I actually hung out with him quite a bit that freshman year. And I ended up hitting him up and I was like, hey man, this is what I want to do. You're on the team. What do you think is the likelihood that I can actually play here? And he was like, dude, you could definitely play special teams. You could make a name for yourself here. Like I fully believe that, knowing kind of who I was from that high school era. And that was really the kind of the only nudge that I needed, because I knew I wanted to stay at Ohio State. And that's when I then told my high school coach about this. He got me in touch with the offensive line coach at the time, which was Ed Warner. And then through that connection, I was able to basically leverage a walk-on spot from there. And that's really when I decided, I met with the lacrosse coach at Ohio State, decided to step away from the lacrosse team, give up my scholarship. It was going to be really just too much for what I wanted to dedicate to try to balance both. That off season was so crucial to make a name for yourself, and I really wanted to utilize that. If I played both, I would never have an off season with either sport. So I really wanted to leverage that as an opportunity to make a name for myself. So I knew it had to be one sport or the other. And that's when I met with the lacrosse coach, had that conversation. Shout out to Nick Myers. He was incredible through this transition where, he was like, hey man, you always have a home here if you want to come back to the lacrosse team, but run with this feeling if this is how you're feeling. And so I did. I decided to step away from the lacrosse team. I gave up my scholarship and I walked onto the football team. And this is really when, this whole realm of what it really meant to work hard and train hard and go after something, and really delay that gratification when you want to get somewhere. That's when that whole journey started for me, because in my mind, like many naive athletes, young athletes, and even for myself, I had the mindset that, I could go in there and play right away. I was going to go in and dominate immediately. That was just my thought process. And it was a wake-up call when I joined that football team. I started at the absolute lowest of the low, literally not even a preferred walk-on, essentially. I was basically invited to sit in the stands. I was basically just like a practice squad guy. I didn't even stand on the sidelines at this point. So like legitimately, when I say the lowest of the low, you've got like 130 guys on the football team, and there's like a huge chunk that, travel. There's another chunk that like dresses out for games. There's another chunk that wears a jersey on the sideline. And then there's another chunk that are literally in the stands. And I was one of those guys. And this was a rude awakening, because I knew the potential I had as an athlete, and I knew what I had accomplished previously, as many of us athletes do. So you have that almost sense of entitlement. And I had that sense of, okay, I really deserve to play on this team. It was almost the mindset I had. And looking back, I was just so wrong. I had to earn that spot. I had to level up myself. I had to grow beyond that place that I was in, because where I was at was not going to get me to that place I wanted to be. It wasn't going to get me on the field at Ohio State. I had to go through that uncomfortable growth and looking myself in the mirror and realizing I didn't have it all figured out, and realize that I had to grow beyond this current state. And that was a huge initial life lesson for me during that trajectory, because you just learn so much about yourself, and you really learn the most about yourself during the hardest moments, not the moments when it's sunshine, rainbows, and everything's working in your favor. You really learn the most about yourself in your hardest moments. And in that moment is when I really learned how to step up. It was in the background where, you didn't really have many people, cheering you on other than some friends and some family. Most of the people on the team don't really want you there as a walk-on. Most of the coaches definitely don't want you there. They definitely don't want you playing, especially because they've recruited all these guys that they really want to see get on the field. And, this is when I really just made the decision that I could no longer play the victim, because for many of those years, especially that first year on the football team at Ohio State in 2014, we did win a national championship, which insane first year to be on the football team. But I realized that I had this victim mentality and this sense of entitlement, like I said earlier, where I felt entitled to get on that field. I was playing the victim, blaming my situation, blaming coaches. I mean, it was a literal mind game playing on that team because you just had so many people in front of you. So that's really when I made that decision that I have to drop that victim mentality. I really have to drop that mindset that I was entitled to get on the field. I was entitled to be a part of this team. And that's when I really started working harder than I ever have. And that's when I started to realize that, there's these certain opportunities in practice, when we're watching film to really execute and level up. And if I executed in these certain moments, that coaches were watching, I knew I would make a name for myself. I knew I could eventually grab the attention of these coaches through hard work and through really standing out amongst the people that were around me. And it was one of the hardest things I've ever done because you're surrounded by 5-star athletes. You're surrounded by legitimately the best of the best. And in that moment, I had to decide to show up every day and really just give it my all. And Justin, who I had on the podcast for the first episode of the Everyday Athlete podcast, we talked about it briefly, but that's when we really had to band together and make that commitment to one another that, hey, we're going to hold each other accountable to keep this mindset, to show up every day and show out, to prove that we deserve a spot on this field, that we deserve a spot on this team. And I think, honestly, playing under Urban Meyer is what helped facilitate a lot of that mindset. He's a controversial dude, and a lot of guys some guys that played under him will tell you they loved him. Other guys will say the opposite. And it was just his very aggressively honest coaching style. And I couldn't help but think about this as I was even working out this morning, and I was listening to an amazing podcast. As you guys know, I love podcasts. I love listening to audiobooks, reading books, constantly focusing on my own personal development. Somebody I really look up to and that I really love consuming their content is Nick Bear, the founder, owner of BPN Supplements. And he actually, on his podcast, was explaining this quote from Nick Saban that I wanted to read. And he said, if you're an average player, you want to be left alone because you want to slide by. If you're a good player, you want to be coached. If you're a great player, you want the coach to tell you the truth every day. The greatest players, the most successful teams and individuals, they want to be told what they're doing wrong and what they're doing right. Because what they're doing wrong, they realize they have to change, which causes them to improve, to get better. They experience more success. The team experiences more success. But as uncomfortable as it may be, and as hard as it is to hear at times, feedback, criticism, and change are the very things that drive growth. That change leads to improvement. For some people, that feedback is so hard to hear that it breaks them. Change breaks people who are brittle. And I want to repeat that. Change breaks people who are brittle. And this was that moment where I had to decide, am I going to be brittle, or am I going to step up and am I going to level up my abilities and my growth and face that discomfort to become the person I wanted to become the athlete and the player on that team that I ultimately wanted to become? And that's really was a huge turning point for me. And I think that, that quote, and that's a Nick Saban quote I just read, just closely mimics Urban Meyer's culture that he facilitated at Ohio State. And another coach, that I had that I really, and I laugh, and Justin and I talked about this on the first episode, was Coach Fickell, now the head coach at Wisconsin. It was one of those things where, as I'm reading that quote, it's about the uncomfortable conversations. It's about the constructive criticism. It's about people telling you what you need to hear in order for you to grow and develop. And Coach Fickell was very much so that person for me that told me the uncomfortable, honest truth. We did this exercise one off season where the coaches would evaluate, and this was like early on, like my freshman, sophomore year being on the football team, and the coaches would evaluate basically your overall just like aura as an individual, and would we hire you or not? And when I say like the aura, it's not just like how you carry yourself, but how do you impact the people around you? Are you somebody negative that brings people down? Or are you somebody positive that brings everyone else around you up? And that's really where he looked me in my face one off season and he said, during this exercise, he said, I will not hire you. And it was the most uncomfortable thing in the world. All these other guys in the linebacker room were, he was telling them, yeah, I'd hire you, and we knew their work ethic. It was obvious, but I was this new guy. I still had so much to prove. And while that sucked, while it was the most uncomfortable thing that I could have ever heard, it put me in that moment of, was I gonna sink or swim? Kind of like what I said with the quote, change breaks people who are brittle. I had to make that decision. Was I going to break in that moment, or was I going to take this constructive criticism from Coach Fickell and level up my abilities, level up my mindset, and push beyond this current state. And thank God I decided to do that, because that's really what ultimately led me to getting a scholarship, to getting on the field, to winning championships, to really establishing and learning some of my biggest life lessons that have carried with me into being the person that I am today. And during that football experience, I really feel like I put all my chips in. It was one of those things where it seemed so impossible. It seemed like such a massive hill to climb. And once I started to have success and I started to see that there was a future for me on this team and see that there was a future for me with football in general, I put all my chips in, which again was another mistake, because I will never forget, and I talked about this recently, I think on the podcast with CJ last week or on our last episode, and we were talking about Terry McLaurin, and I'll never forget, it was like one of his first years in the NFL, and he said, "Football is what I do, it is not who I am." And in that moment, I made football who I was. And it was a big mistake, because as great as it was in the moment, the fall was even greater on the back end. And this is where I decided to put those chips in, do pro day at Ohio State. I was having a lot of production on special teams. I was starting to play significantly on offense at fullback. And I realized, I'm like, this could really be it. I could make an NFL team. And that's when I started training for pro day post my college career. Stayed at Ohio State, started training for pro day. And at the same time, I had graduated from Ohio State, but I wanted to get kind of that plan B started. And I didn't really have a strong plan B, but I did know I wanted some postgraduate degree. I was not sure who I was or what I wanted to do outside of football at that point. So I decided to get my MBA, and I actually got it through Lindenwood University, which is back home in St. Louis, Missouri. And luckily, I was able to start that first semester fully online. So I was able to do my MBA, work on classes for that, while I'm training for pro day at Ohio State, and ended up doing pro day, had a great performance, ran my 40-yard dash in 4.69 seconds, which is a really solid 40-yard dash time for a guy of my size and my position. Did really well on the bench press, 225, like 26 times, and ended up doing really well all around. The drills and all. One quick story with that, which is crazy, is the whole time I was training for pro day, I had torn my metatarsal in my foot, and any basically like ankle flexion, foot flexion, when you're pushing against the toes, which is legitimately every time you walk or run, would be just like excruciating pain. So I was battling the rehab for that while trying to prepare and perform with a day where those metrics matter the absolute most. And battling this injury that whole time was really a mind game in and of itself. But when I got to pro day, I completely blew it out. Like on my second 40-yard dash, I felt a massive pop, and I'm like, I could barely even walk. I remember I was sitting in the car, in my buddy Justin's car. After the fact, we were driving home, and I'm like, I can't even walk, dude. And so in that moment, I really exhausted it. I exhausted everything I had, and honestly, nothing came of it. And I had put all my chips in to this. I had really no strong plan B. I was working on the MBA, but I had no idea what I really wanted to do. And that's when I had to make a decision of, once again, do I play the victim or do I level up? Do I allow myself to become brittle and be broken by this change, or once again, level up again and become a better version of myself and grow beyond this point? And that was a long process, and it was definitely not easy. And I remember during a lot of that time, I definitely was playing that victim again. And the woe is me. How did I not get picked up? These other guys that I played with that arguably played less than me, had less production, were getting signed to rookie mini camps. Why was I not? And that really impacted me for, I would say, a couple years after the fact. That's when I just basically decided to focus on finishing out the NBA. Nothing came, of that. I did get a workout with the Cleveland Browns, which was a really cool experience. And then, did pro day, but again, nothing came of it. No coaches showed much interest. I even had like a lot of my coaches from Ohio State hitting me up like, "Hey, have you heard anything yet? Have you heard anything yet?" And nothing came of it. And so I focused on finishing out that NBA and kind of took that natural segued approach into corporate America, where, most people were like, "Hey, Zach, you'd be really good at sales. You'd crush it in that. You should get into that." So I just decided to get into sales, started out in a corporate sales job. And I quickly decided during that time that this is not for me. I came into that Ohio State culture, and it changed me. It changed my mindset, and it changed my level of expectation for really myself and also the people around me and who I wanted to be surrounded with. And I just remember being in this first job pretty early on being like, okay, this is not it. This is definitely not the culture that I was looking for. I want to be around high performing individuals, high achieving individuals, people who are at my caliber from a mindset standpoint. And I just soon realized that wasn't it. And really up until this point, I really always deep down had the desire to do something on my own, to become an entrepreneur. Back when we were at Ohio State, they would do these real life Wednesdays, and Cardell and I talked about this on episode 3. And this is really where I got exposed really for the first time of all these different leaders and entrepreneurs who had started just like every one of us, but had built something substantial through that delayed gratification, which is exactly what I had learned as an athlete. And during that time in my corporate job and dealing with that post-football non-success really messed with me mentally. And I really was struggling during this time. This is when I was feeling really anxious and I just was struggling with my identity. I felt lost and empty. My mental health was not in a good place. And this is really where I was forced to really look inward and decide, what do I want my life to really look like? Where do I want this journey to go? I think a lot of us guys, especially as athletes, we reach that pivotal moment where we just stop. And I'm going to talk about that concept even a little bit later. But when we, run into that adversity, we just stop. And I'm telling you guys, breaking through that, pushing through that discomfort, and it sucks. We talked about this on all the podcasts up until this point. It never is easier breaking through that, but you will always be better on the other side. I can promise you that. And something that I had to learn the hard way is how important working on my mental health was. Working on my mental health is equally as important as my physical health. And a lot of us guys want to suppress that and we want to push it down. And that's honestly what I did for years. And it was bottled up and it will eventually erupt. And I hit a point where I was so just not myself in this job. I knew change had to happen. And once again, very similar to that football experience, you guys are seeing that theme here. I was faced with that decision. Do I break or do I grow? And it was one of those decisions where I made that decision to grow. Fitness was always a huge part of my life. It was always there. And that's the irony with this whole entire conversation is the fact that it was staring me down literally this whole time. I started working out literally when I was in 8th grade. My grandpa, he served in World War II. I was really close with my grandparents, and we would always go over to their house when I was younger, back when I was living in St. Louis. And I remember as I was transitioning into that 7th, 8th grade time period, there was just something in me that I wanted to work out. I just wanted to lift weights. I was always fascinated by it. Probably because I'm a huge nerd. I love superhero movies. I grew up massive superhero nerd, and I'm obsessed with all the Marvel stuff. And probably that, just looking at all these jacked guys, as a kid, you're that's who I want to be. So that probably is a lot of what influenced it, but just that natural curiosity for training and lifting weights and working out. And I'll never forget my grandpa in 8th grade gave me his old janky dumbbells, plate loaded dumbbells, plate loaded janky barbells with steel around the steel that would move on the handle. It was absurd, probably from the World War II days or somewhere in between. And I started there, started going to a rec center, working out, getting into it at a very young age. So literally since I was in 8th grade, I've pretty much been lifting weights, training, doing fitness in some capacity before I was even a high level athlete. And then obviously carrying that through as a high level athlete. And the whole time I was always I had this just natural curiosity for it, where I just always felt a draw to understanding, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? What is this doing for us? And it was just staring me down this whole time. And it took me getting to that breaking point of losing my identity as the athlete, losing my identity as the football player, to basically have that realization of this been here all along, dude. This is it. This is that avenue to go into. And at first, I didn't really know how I wanted to get into it. I didn't really know, what would this look like? And once again, I kind of just followed my gut and followed what felt right. I listened to and networked with guys at the strength and conditioning level that were my coaches at Ohio State. I thought I was going to go that route at first, and eventually just decided that I really wanted to do it in my own way. I also saw this as an opportunity to do my own thing. Kind of like I said earlier, I always had that gut feeling of just wanting to do something on my own and be an entrepreneur in some capacity. And I saw this as that outlet. I also was inspired by my own personal experiences in the gym and in training and with fitness, where I saw a lot of subpar approaches. It's a notorious profession that lacks professionalism. And I was just determined to bring a whole nother level to fitness, to training that really has never been done before. A level of attention to detail that I did not receive as an athlete. And, I always kind of joke about, my college strength and conditioning experience. I had some really good coaches, but I also had some that did not have that high level of attention to detail. And me now being 5 years into this thing, I realize sometimes, those individuals that I was around, both in the collegiate weight room, but even throughout high school and even as a younger athlete, there's just not that level of attention to detail across the board. And with health and with fitness and training especially, and I was just talking about this on Instagram yesterday, that attention to detail is literally everything. That attention to detail in the gym and in training is the difference of being in constant pain or being able to lift heavy ass weight 100% pain free. That attention to detail is the difference of feeling the right muscle working or overcompensating and not even building, growing, strengthening the tissue that we're trying to work. Those details are literally everything. And that's when I decided, I'm going to bring that level of attention to detail, that level of professionalism to this field of strength, conditioning, health, fitness, training, and really rise the standard and raise that standard well beyond where I had experienced it. That's really where I decided to go into fitness and make this really my career and what I was going to do for the rest of my life, and really commit to this, and not just for the next year or 2 years, but legitimately for a decade plus. And, even interacting in most gyms, more of a motivation even was seeing how a lot of people were doing things and even seeing how a lot of trainers were doing things, and just having that motivation to bring that new level of expertise to this field. So all that motivation for really raising that standard for training and fitness led me to get my first training certification in 2020. That's when I got started out, first and foremost, just had to get started with some level of education and really certify myself as a professional in this industry. And from there, I got a few other certifications with my USAW, my USA weightlifting certification, my precision nutrition certification. And those over time really helped me gain so much knowledge around those topics. But it's really when I started working with clients right out the gate in 2020, when I started to really learn what this was all about. Getting that hands-on experience, working with my first ever client, Lonnie Brown, who I'm still working with to this day. He actually owns the tire shop right across the street from the gym. And when I was transitioning into becoming a trainer for the first time, I was kind of scoping out different gyms that I wanted to work at. And that's when I found Colossus Barbell Club, which I'm still training at to this day. And he was the owner of the tire shop across the street and needed a trainer. And he was my first ever client. And from there, I really built my business around just high quality training, actually getting these people results, not just having them come in and just, work out, but actually driving change and adaptation. And me and him crushed it together. Like I said, we're still working together to this day. He started to refer some people to me. And then I also started to market myself online and on my social media, which also was helping me get a client base built in person. And in those first couple of years, I was really just focused on building that in-person business. And from there, slowly started to segue into helping people virtually, kind of all around the United States, like people who living all over, getting that hands-on help, that hands-on expertise, but through a virtual approach. And so that's when I started to build that online side of things. And that's when I was balancing both the in-person and the online. And I reached a decision, which is actually a fairly recent decision, where which one was I going to pursue? Was I going to pursue one or the other? Was I going to try to balance both of these? One of the biggest challenges I've faced throughout my life is the complacency that creeps in after a big accomplishment. So in that experience where, I was playing football and that left me, I had that idea of just falling off. I reached that mountain and then stopped. But then, like I said, I was faced with that decision of, would I accept that? Would I just accept this and accept this life? Or would I go for something that I actually wanted and go after the life that I actually wanted to be living and doing the job that I actually wanted to do? And very similarly, I was kind of hit with that decision midway through owning and operating my own business, kind of torn between these two approaches, online, in person. I only have so much time. I can only dedicate, myself to these things in a certain capacity. And I had to make a decision, and I actually decided to focus more on the online side of it. And through that experience, once again, I actually kind of started to lose myself. I started to lose, that passion and that love that I had when I'd started out doing the in-person training. And I was hit, again, with that decision of, hey, I don't think I made the right call here. How do I readjust, or what do I need to do to get myself back? And that's where I got myself to now, where I'm balancing both equally. I've got a good handle and grasp on both of those, and I'm continuing to try to grow those and attract more of these like-minded men that I've been able to work well with in both of these atmospheres. And so, leaning into that was huge for me. Leaning into that feeling of, okay, maybe this isn't right. Maybe this isn't where I want to be. Very similarly to what I experienced as an athlete. And this is where I think, it's just so easy to get that feeling of, like I talked about, where you achieve something significant and that natural tendency is just to stop. You climb that mountain and you're good, but it's truly about continuing that journey and continuing to grow and develop beyond our current state. And this is really kind of what I was describing when I was deciding between, the online or the in-person, how to balance my business. And I also started to feel similarly around this time, because this was basically toward the end of last year going into this year. And around the same time, I started to get a little bit of complacency in my own fitness journey, in my own training. And to the outside world, like, you wouldn't even really be able to see or tell, I was still getting after it in the gym. I was still going hard, but there was just, I wasn't pushing myself beyond that current state. And that's when I started to get into, like, the endurance training, and really started to explore, half marathon training, high rocks training. And I started to realize that this began to elevate me beyond my current state. It started to push me beyond where I was. And so around this time last year, kind of balancing that decision with the business, also balancing my own training as an athlete, I was really kind of just getting into that complacency again, where I had been at in the past, where you accomplish something, you do something. I did what I wanted to do with starting the business and getting it up and running. Literally when I started out, I had to pull whatever savings I had from my corporate job at the time, which I did. And I was like, I'm going to live off of this and just make this thing work. Fast forward, I've been able to scale the business successfully every single year since. So we've had a lot of success, but again, complacency always follows that success. It's always that moment of, we have that goal, we accomplish it, we get over that mountain, and then it's like, now what? I experienced this, winning championships as a D1 athlete, and I've experienced it through evolving my business and growing my business over time. And my biggest piece of encouragement, and this is a huge reason why I created the whole brand identity of Everyday Athlete, being Evolve Your Edge, because we have to continually push, and we can continually push that edge, but it's going to, the approach and the execution and what we're doing is going to change and evolve over time. And I think it's just so key to embrace that, because I feel like so many of us, and a lot of us guys that have been on the or a lot of the guys that have been on the podcast so far have talked about this, where, we see it with a lot of the guys that we played with and the other athletes around us. And it's just so easy to fall off after one of those big accomplishments. And this is why, through Evolve Your Edge, I just want to encourage you guys to continually push yourself and continue to push yourself outside of that comfort zone, because this whole entire podcast has been about that, pushing beyond your current state, really how much you can grow when you do decide to take on that discomfort and go through those uncomfortable conversations with other people, with yourself even. I think a lot of it comes down to us looking the man in the mirror, and this is what I've had to do, like I said, throughout this journey so many times, and decide, is this who I really want to be, or do I need to take action to change my current state? And I think that if we can do that, we're going to continually build the life that we ultimately want to be living, and we're going to be able to continually architect it and change it and adapt it to fit what we really want to be doing and how we really want to be living. And I think that, this transcends beyond just, fitness and training and health and even my own journey, but it transcends into everything that we run into on a day-by-day basis, everything that you guys experience on a day-by-day basis. We can either, be a victim to these problems or be a victim, to our environment or the adversity that we come in contact with, or we can make that decision, like I was talking about multiple times throughout this episode, where, we're not going to break in those moments. We're going to step up. We're going to evolve. We're going to improve. We're going to maybe have that tough conversation, with our peers, with our coaches, with the people that, really want our best interest at heart. And sometimes it's looking ourselves in the mirror and making that decision as well. And I think that, one of the biggest really life lessons that I've learned throughout this whole journey is how confidence is truly built through evidence. I talked about this on the podcast with CJ, but this concept of confidence being built through evidence stems back to everything that I've accomplished up until this point, where if I had not pushed through during that football experience and decided that, hey, I was going to drop that victim mentality and actually look myself in the mirror and level up, I would have never been able to do that when I was faced with that decision between quitting corporate America and starting my own business. I would have never been able to make that decision when I've been torn, through the evolution of my business on these very intricate business decisions. I would have never been able to make it through each one of those circumstances had I not gained the confidence and the evidence from the previous. So had I not gone through that football experience, no chance I would have been able to start a business. Had I not, gone through that experience, I would have never been able to handle the adversity that I'm now experiencing as a business owner, as we all do. Anyone out there who owns a business knows it's constant evolution, constant changing, constant adapting, and not getting stuck in your ways, which will really force you to evaluate yourself day in and day out. And that is really what the journey of an entrepreneur has been like for me, staring that man in the mirror day in and day out and understanding, am I making the right decisions? Am I making the decisions that are in alignment with my vision and my goals and what I really see for this business as the visionary, as the leader, as the person who created this? And, learning that has been monumental. And I hope that throughout this, conversation and throughout this podcast, you guys can see that trend and that theme of working through that adversity, working through that discomfort, and always becoming better on the other side of it. Because the natural human tendency when we're faced with that, just like I said, in the Nick Saban quote, like for some people, that feedback is so hard to hear that it breaks them. Don't be one of those people that you let it break you. Let it be something that motivates you to level up, to grow, to change, and to ultimately adapt. Because I'm telling you, when you do that, you then build confidence through evidence. You then build up and stack up the evidence that you are who you say you are, that you are following through with the promises that you've made, with the commitments that you've made to yourself. You are the person who follows through. And we prove that to ourselves through action, through doing, not talking about it. And man, I've been notorious for that throughout my life before becoming an entrepreneur, talking about all the different things I was going to do, talking about this idea, that idea, a lot of talk. And then I had to really get real with myself and start taking action. And ever since then, that's what I try to lead with. I really try to just lead with taking action and being proactive instead of reactive, and continually chasing growth and continuing to evolve my own edge as a business owner, as an athlete, as a husband, as a friend, as a coach, as a brother, as a son. I'm allowing that mindset to infiltrate every area of my life for the better. And I encourage you guys to do the same. I think even for a lot of us athletes, and we even see this in even a lot of corporate environments. I remember seeing this in my corporate environment where it was a lot of just like fake rah-rah, where it's like, all this stuff I'm talking about, but we don't really live it. It's just sayings we throw on a wall, or it's just, things that we put at the footnote on an email or on a website. It's not principles that we actually live. And I hope that, you guys can extrapolate these principles from me. I know that, engulfing myself with people like I mentioned, even Nick Bear and, some of these other podcasts, my coach right now, Jeremy Scott, like listening to their podcasts, surrounding myself with people that cherish and embrace that same mindset that I'm talking to you guys with today has been monumental for me. So really, really be careful and be smart about who you surround yourself with, because it can truly infiltrate your mindset in a good way or a bad way. And I've realized that. And I know that, putting myself in a position to embrace this mindset is only going to bring further success and further positive growth. And so I just encourage you guys, man, do the work, go through those go through those uncomfortable situations, work through that adversity, because you will always become a better version of yourself on the other side. And just do not turn the other way. Do not become brittle where when you are faced with those things, you give up or you stop. When you climb that mountain and you have success, celebrate it, but then chase that next mountain and don't stop that process. Keep evolving your edge, because when you do that, you build a pretty badass life and you create a lot of success for yourself in every area of life. Thank you guys for joining us. I really hope you guys enjoyed this episode and were able to extrapolate a lot of these same principles that have really helped bring success in my own journey and my own life. And this is something I want to keep talking about. I want to keep giving you guys and providing you just the raw, authentic details of kind of how I've gotten to where I've gotten, and can continue to document and share this journey along the way. So along with the episodes that we'll do with guests, I'll also be weaving in some of my solo episodes like this, just sharing the journey, also helping you guys, educating you guys, giving you other tips and just pieces of advice, even about everything that I've learned so far up until this point with health, fitness, training, nutrition, to help you guys further grow and develop. So if you haven't already, make sure you guys like and subscribe to the podcast, and I'll see you guys next episode.